The lottery ticket slipped from between his fingers like a secret. It was small, bright paper against the grey of the alley. For a single, ridiculous second, Cristian thought it would float on air and return to him. Instead, it caught on a sodden takeout box and fluttered, a tiny flag of possibility that whispered of escape, of bills paid, of the mortgage relieved, of the late nights of worry softened into something like relief. He reached. Missed. A hand moved faster than his, fingers practiced and quick, and the ticket was gone before he could curse. The hand belonged to a woman with a coat that had once been black, but had resigned itself to the weather. It belonged to someone whose palms were cracked, whose nails were stained the color of rain. She held the scrap up to the thin light and frowned at the numbers as if they were a private map only she could read. Cristian stood in the doorway of the bodega, heat and coffee and the smell of frying oil behind him, feeling the shock sink into his bones like a physical weight. The ticket meant nothing and everything, a foolish, impossible hope he had spent $14 on after a day at a job that left his wrists raw with tension. Michelle would laugh if she saw him now, an adult man frozen in a doorway like a child who had lost his marbles. He wanted to laugh, too, because the world had always rewarded his laughter with small favors, pay raises after long nights, compliments that made him straighten his shoulders. But tonight, his laughter stuck in his throat. The woman tucked the ticket into the pocket of her coat, where it disappeared under old receipts and the loose change of someone who had learned to keep their treasures under layers. She did not look up at him. Her eyes were set on something further down the block, another man with a cigarette, another dog tied to a trash can, attention parceled out in practiced measure. No apology, no flourish, just the small, pragmatic motion of someone who had learned not to gamble with the kindness of others. Cristian could not shake the image. He bought another ticket on impulse. He told himself he was only being ridiculous, that he was indulging the absurd. He imagined the kinds of things he would do with the money. Pay off the line of credit that collected interest like a jealous lover. Put new tires on the car so Michelle wouldn't scold him for the way they squealed on wet streets. Surprise her with a cheap bouquet when she expected nothing. He imagined them together, laughing, reconciled. That image felt like stepping into a memory he had not yet lived. When he came home that night, the house was the same house he had signed for when he was 31 and confident, the one with 2 small bedrooms and a kitchen that smelled faintly of garlic. There was the same cheap wooden table that had been a wedding present, the same framed photo of them on a beach she had insisted they visit when they couldn't afford the second mortgage payment. Michelle was at the sink, sleeves rolled, the steam of the kettle washing her hair into soft, dark curtains. She smiled, but the smile was a strategy she'd learned to deploy like an appliance. "You're late," she said, and the words hit like a line item on a bill. "I had to stay," he began. "Late pitch, You're always late," she said. And with that small dismissal, she turned to the radio, to a conversation about a neighbor's precise landscaping and the charity drive downtown. There was no shared minute left between them unless someone scheduled it in, and both remembered to show up. Cristian's wrist brushed the envelope in his pocket. The second ticket was smooth and hopeful. He almost told her about it, about the woman in the alley, about the way the ticket had fluttered, but the thought of reaching across this gulf and being met by polite indifference gutted him. Instead, he set the ticket down on the table and left it where the light from the lamp made a small, hopeful stage. The first blow was small and surgical. Michelle called him into the bedroom with the tone people used when they were about to teach someone a lesson they were sure would be obeyed. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers threaded tight in the hem of her blouse, and when she spoke, her voice was smooth, like glass on glass. The discovery came from a phone in a drawer, a message thread with a name he trusted, a string of photographs he would have preferred to burn. "It's over," she said, before he could ask what she meant. "I've signed the papers." For a moment he thought she was joking. This was the kind of cruelty that required a punchline to be bearable, but the legal envelopes on the dresser told him otherwise. He read the words without absorbing them: separation, claim, division of assets. There was a coldness there, a mathematical mind at work who had learned to count the value of endings. Henry's name appeared like a shadow in the doorway, in the scent of someone else's cologne on a T-shirt he had once liked. They did not speak. They did not raise hands or voices. The wound drilled into him with a bureaucrat's efficiency. Filings, signatures, court dates. She had anticipated the angles. She had anticipated his pride and sliced it small. The betrayal was not a scene he could dramatize. It was paperwork and counsel and the terrible arithmetic of lawyers who made money folding pain into schedules. Word spread through mutual friends with the speed of a rumor. People who had once invited him to fishermen's breakfasts and bottle-sharing nights now averted their eyes. The small circles he had lived inside tightened as if to remove him. At the office, the story became a thing they discussed over the coffee machine. Phrases like volatile situation, unfortunate personal matter, and distraction were used like gloves to handle an animal nobody wanted to admit they once loved. Cristian tried to argue. He tried to unravel the web of messages he had seen. He tried to make Michelle explain why, if Henry had been so important, she had not said a single word in the years when their bank balance was thin and the nights were cold and their conversations had been mostly about getting by. She had answers that sounded like statutes. "You were never home," she said. "You were never present." She spoke as someone who had rehearsed cruelty into reason. There were negotiations over the house. Michelle's lawyer was tidy and efficient, a woman named Regina who wore conservative suits like armor. She moved through the divorce like a person ordering parts for a machine, and while Cristian flailed, she filled out forms. The bank notices arrived with the unobtrusive finality of an obituary. Letters arrived, stamped and concise. Default, arrears, notification of lien. The mortgage company called. When he picked up, the person on the line spoke without inflection, as if reading a script in which human life was only a variable. He lost his job a month later. That loss was not immediate violence. It was a series of small exclusions. His manager pulled him aside in a conference room with too bright fluorescent lighting and told him that numbers had slipped. The cracks were visible. Clients had been reluctant. "We need someone wholly present," his manager said. And Cristian understood this to mean that the company needed someone whose home life did not make the front page of the kind of small-town gossip where their clients still ate dinner. He packed a box of 8 years of late-night reports and photos of sales dinners and left the building smelling of lemon cleaner and the precise antiseptic optimism of corporate lobbies. The first letter of embargo came like a summons. The county clerk's office sent notice of a hearing, an opportunity for the mortgage company to secure their claim. It was the kind of language designed to compress a life into a docket number. Property at risk. The next day, a sheriff's deputy took down the locks of the house for an hour as men in uniforms walked the rooms and catalogued the furniture like inventory for a future neither of them would see. He watched through the window while they listed the couch and the coffee table and the ugly lamp Michelle had insisted on, and each item logged felt like a ledger scraping away the person he had been. People are not, as a rule, taught how to be shamed publicly. The technique has a social choreography. Look down, walk shorter, say less. For a while, Cristian tried to keep up appearances. He slept in his car some nights, the roof of the vehicle warm with residual October sun, the radio buzzing low. He told himself that this was temporary, that with a new job he could gather the pieces and put them back together like a puzzle. But the rejections began to double like bad interest rates. Applications returned with polite, templated refusals. A former colleague accused him of being distracted in a phone call that was more a courtesy than anything else. Small kindnesses became rare. There were other corrosive things at work, too. Rumors that he had been irresponsible with company funds, a whisper campaign crafted by people who benefited from his fall. Those who had once shared meals with him at the cheap diner were suddenly hesitant to make the eye contact required to recognize a human being. He felt the air go thin around him, each breath measured against the weight of public judgment. The humiliation reached a point where he found himself sifting through the refuse behind the bodega where he had stood the night of the ticket. A shame that was less a moral judgment than a physical ache. He had not planned to find anything. Survival has a way of turning principles into luxuries. He was careful, methodical, because even indignity can be practiced. This was not a scene of cinematic degradation. No glamorous montage, no tearful revelation. It was life taking what it could, item by item, showing itself as an economy of loss. And then Sarah appeared again. She had the look of someone who had learned to make small economies of comfort out of the world. She kept things in pockets, not because they were poor, but because she had learned to be stealthy with the few things she had found that were worth the risk. When she saw him, she did not recoil. She did not pronounce him a fallen man, with the moral certainty people often wield like weapons. Instead, she moved toward him with the same practical air she had used the night she took the ticket. Hands that knew which things were useful and which were not. "You're looking for something," she said, and it was not a question as much as a report. Her voice was low, the kind that had been softened by nights in open air and conversations that had no easy end. He laughed because there was nothing else. The laugh sounded ridiculous to his own ears, a thin thing that accused him of cowardice. "My life," he said, and it came out as satire. She held up the crumpled ticket he had imagined lost in a different life. "I saw this once," she said, "thought it belonged to someone who wanted to lose things." Her eyes examined his face like an appraisal, not cruel, but thorough. "You keep things you shouldn't, too." There was a moment when he thought she would walk away with his last childish hope. He braced himself, but she did not. She slid the ticket into his palm, not with the arrogance of someone granting mercy, but with the casualness of someone returning a found wallet. There was no sermon in her motion, just the blunt fact of a choice made. "Don't spend it on fantasy," she said. "Spend it on something that keeps you warm tonight." He wanted to argue about dignity, about pride, about the fact that the universe owed him more. What he said was, "Why didn't you sell it? It could have—" "I didn't sell it because I don't steal," she said simply. "I keep what I find until I meet who lost it." Her voice folded around the words patience and practical ethics, not sanctimony. And because sometimes people need a thing that seems small to feel like the world still notices them. That evening he slept at the edge of a park bench, with the ticket folded in his wallet like a small, ridiculous prayer. The sky was full of indifferent stars, and the city hummed in an untroubled midnight language. He thought of Michelle in the bedroom, with her precise arguments, and the way the world had arranged itself to be indifferent to his loss. He thought of Henry laughing with the ease of a man who had never been taught shame. He thought of his own hands, and the tremor that would not stop when he tried to write a new resume. His life had been stripped to a skeleton. He did not know the way to grow new skin. She found him the next morning with coffee in a dented thermos and a pair of gloves to match. She sat on the bench across from him and did not ask for anything. For a long time they simply existed near one another, two people given to different kinds of exile. She had a small bag of possessions, each item chosen like a talisman: a spare scarf, a paperback book with a broken spine, a photograph of a younger woman with the eyes of someone who had not yet been taught to surrender. Her name was Sarah, she told him, And when he asked how long she had been sleeping where she slept, she said matter-of-factly, "Long enough to learn where the warm spots are." Over the next weeks, their lives began to overlap in small, steady ways that created the scaffolding of a new kind of world. She introduced him to the rhythms of survival not with pity, but with blunt utility. There were soup kitchens with predictable lines, and people who spoke in the hushed conspiracies of those who had formed families out of mutual aid. There was a women's shelter that accepted applications at 9 sharp. Sarah drew up a map and circled the things that mattered: where to stand to avoid the rain, how to talk to the intake worker so they would not assume you were dangerous, which bus routes avoided the main traffic and made the walk less humiliating. "Don't go in pretending you're someone you're not," she advised one morning as they shared a sandwich she had traded for a favor. "They can smell desperation. Everybody's got it. You don't need to advertise yours." She said it with a crispness that stung but also steadied. She had rules for small dignities: keep a shoelace for tying loose hems, always carry a thin towel for the public bathrooms, and never, ever accept a ride from someone offering more than companionship. Cristian listened and learned. It was not easy. Pride is its own muscle. Once it withers, it takes time to rebuild. She told him about places where he could wash. There was a laundromat that let you wash for a quarter if you knew the manager, and how to make a sleeping spot under a door awning without seeming like he had surrendered to the street. She taught him to measure his days not by the calendar, but by the small victories. One meal eaten without nausea, a clean pair of socks, a day without a fight with his reflection. When he complained about the unfairness of it all, she did not counter with a sermon. Instead, she offered tiny, unromantic counsel. "Grief is not the same as a plan," she would say. "You can carry both." Meanwhile, the world that had been his life continued to grind away without him. Michelle's legal counsel had been more effective than he could have anticipated. She had managed to secure temporary possession of the house as a way to stabilize the children's schooling. She framed it as responsible. The papers that had once felt like a weapon to him now shape-shifted into a shield for her, a way to justify posture and relocation, to explain the new curtains and the charity fund contributions that friends would find admirable. Henry posted photos of vacations and new dinners. Their lives were an album intended for the public square. People congratulated her on her pragmatism. People did not, in those notes and comments, think to ask what it had cost someone else. A man named Gina, an older woman with an eye for people who had something to surrender, saw Cristian on one of his lower days. She approached with the practiced sympathy of someone who had once used other people's misery as an instrument for profit. Gina offered a place to sleep in exchange for work that pressured him toward things he did not yet understand. She suggested schemes that promised fast cash and whispered about loopholes and quick claims. He wanted to believe. If pride could be bought back with money, then perhaps humility could be bartered. But each proposal felt like a trap, even when wrapped in the language of assistance. He turned down Gina's offers, not because he was above them, but because something inside him resisted the vulgar economy of quick damage. He had lost much, but he had not yet lost the last crumb of his own ethical discomfort. Once, in a moment where hunger made decisions feel immediate and urgent, a man offered him a job that required him to run a package at odd hours without questions. The pay was enough to feel like rescue. He thought of the ticket folded into the wallet in his pocket, and of Sarah's face when she had tucked a thermos into his hands. He remembered her words about small dignities and about not advertising desperation. He thought about the way charity felt like a hand that bruised if you accepted too many favors. The choice felt like standing at a cliff and being asked to step. The cliff was forged of pride and pressure. The wind was made of shame and the desire to survive with a face intact. He wanted to choose both, as if one could be folding his life back into order while never conceding the parts that had been wrong. But the world is less forgiving of contradictions than we are of ourselves. Either you sell your dignity or you learn to buy it back with time. Sarah watched him in these moments with an ironic, patient gaze. She did not offer advice unless he asked. Instead, she sat with him as a witness to his decisions, which more than anything is what people who have known suffering crave, to have someone else in the room when the choice is made. Once, after he had turned down a job that smelled of illicitness, she lowered her voice and said, "Most people think surviving is a sprint. It's a slow arithmetic. You want to live more than you want to be safe sometimes. Both are honest." The path down into public shame had been paved with small social humiliations. A former neighbor who avoided looking at him, the landlord who turned down his plea for delayed rent with clinical courtesy, a friend or two who said, with genuine sorrow, "You should have seen this coming." There were also quiet, intimate losses, his sheets taken by the bank auction, a favorite mug packed away and handed over to a woman with neutral hands. He learned what it meant to be someone whose name was known for misfortune. And then the worst thing happened, the kind of cruelty that is less a single cruel design and more a series of decisions by people who believed that their future required the removal of his. Michel filed a claim that complicated his life in ways he had never anticipated. Claims over early retirement funds, accusations about the handling of a small trust he'd once invested in, papers that suggested impropriety in his recent job that were technically ambiguous but devastating in public light. The media picked the story as if it were a fable about moral laxity, and headlines framed his name in angles that made it difficult to breathe. He went to court with a file so full of contradictions he could barely hold it upright. The judge asked questions in the language of law that made his mistakes feel like mechanical failures. He tried to explain. He tried to make his life a story of loss that didn't absolve him, but that demanded context. The judge's gavel was not a weapon aimed at him. It was a device used to adjudicate. The result was the same. His life, in legal terms, had been reallocated. He found himself finally outside the categories that insurance and society reserve for domesticated men. He slept on sofas when people allowed it. He took a place on the floor of a friend's office once, curled beneath a coat. Pride is not a thing that dies all at once. It frays and then eventually becomes threadbare. The man who had once scheduled his life by business lunches now scheduled it by the soup kitchen hours. Sarah remained an anchor. She did not pretend that she had all the answers. She had her own careful, concealed past, pieces of which she gave him in small doses as trust accumulated. She had been a housekeeper once, she said. She had been fired after a downsizing and then hit by a run of bad luck that left her as resourceful as a fox. She spoke about people she had loved who had made mistakes, which made her less a saint and more an honest mirror. She had learned the ways of the street, but had kept a language of human dignity that did not require explanation. "People forget," she told him one night while they shared a bench that smelled of wet wood and old newspapers, "that being homeless doesn't stop you from being human. It just changes the calendar." Her hands were warm. She had been the one to buy a cheap heater when the winter came early, and the nights grew new kinds of sharp. By now the ticket was irrelevant to other people's plans. It had been a thread that led him to a moment, straight to the edge, where his life could still be rewritten. He had lost jobs, home, social credit. Yet the ticket, folded and smudged at the corners, was a tangible reminder that luck is part rumor, part happenstance, and part the way people respond when the world cracks. Sarah's return of that ticket was not a redemptive moment of money saved or treasure reclaimed. It was a human gesture that nudged him toward a different set of possibilities. Not revenge, not litigation, but survival with dignity. One morning, a man he had known from the office passed them on the sidewalk and stopped. For a moment, Cristian imagined that he would be asked to sign forms that would restore him, that the past life would fold back in if he explained himself correctly. The man glanced at him like a merchant appraising a commodity and then looked away. A modern version of the handshake that had once cemented his belonging had been withheld. The social currency had been spent. It was Sarah who broke the quiet. "You have to choose what kind of person you're going to be now," she said. "You can spend every day trying to call back what you lost, or you can start learning how to make small, honest things for yourself." She did not sound like a preacher. She sounded like someone issuing a practical ultimatum, because reality will not wait for our moral resolutions. He thought for a painful moment of lawsuits and settlements and the kind of vindication that would make his name the correct headline. The thought tasted sweet and bitter at the same time. Sweet for the promise of external proof that he had been wronged. Bitter because it implied a life built only of public correction. Sarah's presence made another option visible. To rebuild the edges of his life where money could not reach him, to learn the humiliating art of asking for help and giving it back later. There was a confrontation later, at a small claims hearing where Michelle sat with an expression of determined thrift. He had prepared a case that was half anger and half paperwork. He wanted to make her pay in more than money. He wanted to set her before a tribunal that would reflect back the damage she had done. But when the opportunity to press charges or accept a public bone presented itself, he found himself unable to proceed. Not because the law was unfair, but because he recognized the exchange they wanted, his pain for their moral satisfaction. He had been the one who needed to change, not her. That idea made him nauseous and freed at once. He walked out of the courthouse with a folded piece of paper in his pocket that said simply what he could not say aloud: dismissed. He felt both robbed and spared. The world had not given him easy closure. It had given him a piece of paper that represented a transaction of some sort. When he met Sarah outside, she reached for his hand with the blunt intimacy of someone who knows the value of touch. "You're not a headline anymore," she said. "You're a person with toes that get cold and a wallet that fits in your back pocket. Neither is a crime." He laughed then, not because the joke was funny, but because laughter felt like a tool he once had and had now found again for a different kind of work. There was a vulnerability to him at that moment that was not yet shame. It was the tentative formation of a new self. One that had been taught humility on a map that began and ended at the edge of human beings who help each other. The transformation had not happened yet. He could still be consumed by the need to reclaim his name, his stuff, his former life. But there was a door now that had been opened, not by money, not by a dramatic vindication, but by a woman with a thermos and an uncanny sense for where to lay a blanket on a cold bench. He did not know if he would accept her continued help when the true tests came. When Henry's shadow reappeared in indirect ways, messages sent through friends, a social media post that was a private humiliation in public, he felt the old hunger for retribution curl its lip. He thought about the ticket and the way Sarah had returned it, about the small kindness that cost her nothing yet had meant everything. He thought about the people who had sided with Michelle, and the way their lives had resumed the comfortable rhythm of a world that rewards a certain kind of cruelty. In the end, the choice before him was a moral one disguised as a practical decision. He could seek the path that promised immediate, if hollow, satisfaction, the dragging of names through courts and the collection of stories that would make him feel, for a little while, like he had returned to power. Or he could follow the slow geometry of rebuilding. Small favors returned, nights spent on benches, replaced by a steady job that paid little, but did not require the compromise of his dignity, the tiny acts of repair that stitched the soul. Sarah did not judge his hesitation. She only offered what she had always offered, clear-eyed practicality, a thermos of coffee in winter, a pair of gloves when his fingers forgot warmth. "You decide," she told him, as if the choice were as simple as buying bread. But know this, revenge fills a hole with ashes. Repair builds something you'll sleep in. He tucked the sentiment into the chest pocket of his jacket, and for the first time in months felt something like a plan form that did not involve courtroom victories. It was a small plan. It involved a day job at a hardware store that paid minimum wage, cleaning public stairwells for a building where the superintendent would give him odd jobs, and eventually learning to ask people for help without using the ugly language of entitlement. It was a plan unlikely to make headlines. That night, when the rain came early and hard and the city folded into the sound of water on pavement, he sat under a bus shelter where the lights made everything look washed and pale. Sarah sat beside him with her head tucked into her scarf and the thermos between them like a shared hearth. He held the ticket in his hand and smoothed it flat. It was worn now, edges frayed, the ink blurred where it had been in pockets and soaked by night. He thought, briefly and with a dull ache, about confronting Michelle and carving out his narrative from the wreckage. But the anger felt like something that would demand more of him than he had to give. He had been destroyed by betrayal. That was the honest thing. The destruction had left him naked and raw. He could let that nakedness ruin him, make him another person defined by the act of being ruined. Or he could allow the small acts of mercy and the quiet work of rebuilding to shape him into someone quieter and cleaner. Sarah never told him what to choose. She only gave him the space to stand at the threshold and decide. The world tended to think transformation was a dramatic pivot. Hers was a patient hand on the small details. She had returned a ticket once, and in so doing had given him more than paper. She had given him an example, a woman who, having been discarded by the world, had kept her own moral life intact. That example, unglamorous and stubborn, was the kind of force that transforms not by miracle, but by accumulation. When the bus came and the light washed overhead, he rose slowly, as if reacquainting himself with his muscles. He folded the ticket and slid it into his wallet. It was not a talisman now. It was evidence of a moment when someone else decided he still mattered. He did not know if that would be enough to rebuild a life, to regain his name in the eyes of a city that had judged him already. But he had a person who would not let him vanish quietly into shame. They walked in silence back toward the place where Sarah kept her things, a corner that smelled of detergent and the lingering warmth of bodies, and he felt something shift in his chest, like the first loosening of a rusted hinge. The transformation began not with a grand gesture, but with small, repeatable acts that added up into a new life. He did not forgive Michelle that night. Forgiveness was, he realized, a future work, perhaps necessary, perhaps not, but not something to be faked for the sake of immediate peace. He had learned, painfully, that letting go and forgiving were different muscles. Right now he needed steadiness, he needed steps he could take. He had to be practical and stubborn in equal measure. When they reached the patch of cardboard and a tarp stretched over 2 low crates, Sarah held out a spare glove and watched him as he accepted it. "Tomorrow," she said, "you start here. There's a man at the hardware store who owes me a favor. Tell him Sarah sent you." The favor would not be much, sweeping floors, fetching nails, counting inventory. It would be work that did not ask him to compromise anything but his time. Cristian nodded. His throat felt tight, the kind of tightness that is the beginning of steadiness. He thought of the ticket in the wallet, and of the life that had been shredded into lists and claims. He thought of the humiliation etched into his name, and of the very small, strange kindness of a woman who had every right to be bitter and none of the right to be pitied. He did not know where this path would end. He only knew that the choice before him The raw, final split between revenge and repair had been presented with a clarity he had not expected. The homeless woman who had returned his lost, foolish hope had become the axis upon which the rest of his life would turn. He could pursue the noise of retribution, a public salve that would not heal deeper wounds, or he could take the hard, patient road of rebuild. The road was bone-wearying and slow, but it promised a quiet dignity he had not felt in a long time. He pressed the ticket between his fingers and felt the ridges of the ink. The city pulsed around them, indifferent and alive. The choice gleamed under the streetlight like something small but durable. Courage without performance, humility without annihilation. He slid his hand into Sarah's, an awkward gesture that was neither a plea nor a surrender, and let the warmth of another human being steady him. When they parted that night, she to her tarp, he to a friend's couch for a few hours, Cristian lay awake, thinking of the long arithmetic Sarah had described. He thought about the way she had moved, about the kindness that did not ask for payment. He catalogued the losses and the tiny mercies, and for the first time in months, the weight in his chest felt like something he could carry, rather than something that would crush him. Some choices are simple acts performed in the middle of the night. To get up and walk toward the hardware store, to refuse the lure of quick money that wore the cloak of rescue. He set his alarm not for a job interview, but for a beginning, a sweep of the floor at 9 a.m., hands moving in a small choreography of honest labor. He would earn his bread. He would, in small increments, learn to be someone who could stand in public without his name prefixed by scandal. Outside, the city moved on. The headlines would continue to cycle through other people's tragedies. The world would show no mercy for those who clung to the hope of vindication. But in a corner that smelled faintly of old coffee and detergent, two people stitched the ragged edge of a life back together with the thread of the simplest thing, consistent, honest presence. The transformation had not yet happened. It would take days, then months of small, steady choices. But the first choice, the one that mattered, had been made. He had decided, in a crooked way, to follow a path that asked humility rather than recompense. And there, beside him, the woman who had no home watched him with the unassuming authority of someone who had built a life from scraps and choices, and the steady refusal to profit from the suffering of others. The first weeks in the hardware store were small, literal things. Sweeping a floor, stacking boxes, learning where the screws for a bathroom faucet lived, and how to tell a customer that a part would take 2 days to arrive. The manager, a man named Victor, with a voice like gravel and a laugh that came out as a cough, watched Cristian with the careful appraisal of someone deciding whether a person could be trusted with other people's tools. Trust, Victor made clear, was earned in the way you returned the correct change and in the way you showed up, rain or shine. Cristian showed up. Work became a measure he could use. The labor was honest and dull in the best way, reliable as tea in a chipped mug. He learned to bend in a way that avoided pride's sharp edges, lifting a box correctly so his back wouldn't give, apologizing when he misfiled an order, admitting he didn't know and asking. Each small competency built him a skeleton he could stand in. He kept the ticket folded in the inner pocket of his jacket, a soft weight that reminded him of the night Sarah had handed it back and of the woman who had decided his life still mattered. It did not glow like a promise anymore. It hummed like a lesson. The mornings began with a walk past the laundromat Sarah had told him about. Some days he stopped and pretended he did not need the coin-operated dryers. Other times he sat across from the storefront with a coffee he had bought for $2 and watched the lives in the windows move in and out, mothers folding, men sorting shirts by color, an old woman pinching lint from a collar with methodical fingers. The world did not pause for his shame. It kept offering small tasks. He paid what little he could toward the arrears. The mortgage lien remained a ghost that hummed in the background. Legal letters still arrived like insects at the light. The dismissal had given him a fragile permission to vanish from the center of his old life, but it had not erased the consequences. He used the hardware wages to set up a little savings account, a humiliating moment of pride when the teller slid the plastic card across and said, "First time, that's something." He learned how to explain himself without performance. "I'm working," he would say, and leave it at that. Sarah continued to be a presence without demand. She had her own mornings to keep, people to check on, ways of hustling that never felt like begging, but rather like negotiation with the city itself. Sometimes she brought a thermos of coffee and sat in the store when Victor's back was turned, reading a paperback with dog-eared pages. She and Victor developed a wary truce born from shared practicalities. He respected that she did not steal. She respected that he gave her a discount when he could. When she had to be gone for a few days, she found temporary work helping with a community cleanup crew. Cristian felt it like an absence beyond logistics. Her presence had become an anchor. Gina reappeared in a shape that smelled of opportunism. She had retooled herself from a woman who eyed people for profit into someone with an air of quasi-sympathy that made her more dangerous. She found him after work, underneath the fluorescent sign, as if she had been following the geometry of his life and knew the points where it bent. "You look like you could use an extra hand," Gina said, and it was not the casual observation of a neighbor. She had a client, a man with pockets the size of small boats, who needed someone to run errands, to move boxes, to be available at odd hours. "Pay would be significant," she said, careful to make the word heavy with promise. "Real money." Cristian listened. The old hunger rose in sudden, shameful spikes. He pictured the ledger at home, the bank notices folded like small punishments, the bank of debt that accrued interest like a second mortgage on his very self. He had been poor before. He knew the grammar of it. He also remembered Sarah's rules about advertising desperation, her careful way of speaking about small dignities. Gina's offer had the soft velvet of rescue. It had the smell of a trap wrapped in sugar. "What am I doing?" he asked instead of accepting. "Running errands? For what? For whom?" "For someone who likes to stay out of sight until the keys are needed," Gina said. "You'd be discreet. You'd make money. You'd stop lying awake." That night Cristian lay on the friend's couch, where he had permission to sleep, and turned the idea around in his head like a coin between fingers. He imagined the money, enough to pay a few bills, to maybe get a small second-hand car he could sleep in safely for a transition. He imagined Michelle's hair when she found out. He imagined Henry's face as something he could purchase contempt for. He imagined the life of cleanliness returned to him, and the public name finally tidied. But he also imagined Sarah's thin hands arguing that survival was slow arithmetic. He imagined the way the work might ask him not only to be present physically, but to lie in ways that would attach shame to his name permanently. He had already been denigrated by rumor and by court filings. He did not want to add to that ledger with his own signature. "I can't," he told Gina the next day, the words more solid than he expected. "Not like that." Gina blinked like someone astonished at an unbiddable commodity. "You could be out of it in a week," she said. "You could clear that mess." "Maybe," Cristian said. "Or maybe it makes more mess." She left with the kind of small, disappointed smile a person reserves for investments that turn out to be moral expenses. Cristian felt both small and proud at once. When Henry's presence reappeared in the social geometry of the city, always at parties, always in photos where light made him look younger and less accountable, Cristian avoided confrontation. He had the tools to drag Henry into court with witness lists and the kind of detail that would make headlines, but he also knew the cost. Courtroom vindication would be a theater of pain. He had already been tried in the court of public opinion. He did not need to stage another trial to prove he had been wronged. Sometimes justice asks you to insist, and sometimes it asks you to relinquish the performance. That distinction was the one he had to learn. There were days when the pull toward performance was strong. A tabloid left its copy at the cafe, where Victor took his lunch. Someone had suggested that if he went public, told his version, the sympathy might recalibrate his life. People might return his calls. A job might appease their curiosity. But Sarah's quiet admonitions echoed, grief is not the same as a plan. He could be both bereft and constructive, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Work continued. He became good at recognizing a customer's distress and naming the exact tool needed, not because he cared about tools more than people, but because in naming a solution, he learned to make space for others' small emergencies. His hands regained a steadiness. The hardware store had a rhythm, a morning rush, a midday lull, an evening cleanup. Victor began to leave him in charge when he had to step away. Small privileges, imperceptible to someone not paying attention, rooted Cristian back into a life where trust was a thing you could earn by being consistent. There was a night when the rain began to hammer the corners of the city in a way that made even the most established awnings feel vulnerable. A woman stumbled into the store, drenched, carrying nothing but a bag and a child's shoe. She had a look of someone who'd been riding the edge of something for a long time, face windburnt, hair a tangle, eyes that measured people in the way of someone who trusted little and needed much. "Can I borrow your phone?" she asked. "Just to call someone." Cristian hesitated. There were company rules about lending devices, but the hesitation was brief. He took her phone and dialed. She thanked him with a voice like a small bell, and then looked down at her hands. "You okay?" he said, because it was what his job had taught him. Call people into being by asking. She shrugged. "A place to stay, a friend I lost last week, money for a bus, the usual." He found himself offering a sandwich from the back, a warm coffee. Victor watched without comment. After she left, she came back and gave him a slow, measured smile. "You remind me of someone," she said. "Someone who used to fix fences at my mother's farm." "Do you farm?" he asked, surprised at where his voice had traveled. "That's a longer past," she said, "but thank you." Small acts multiplied. He learned to hold small things for other people, a coat left in the porch, a textbook someone couldn't afford, a metal bracket that would save a neighbor's door from failing. Each act was a stitch that repaired the fabric between people. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like someone rediscovering the language of usefulness. Months passed on this gentle plane. Sarah found a temporary spot in a community arts program where she helped set up spaces for workshops. She taught children how to patch torn pages in library books and how to plant basil in old tin cans. The program paid in small stipends and the warm approval of people who believed in redemption through craft. Seeing her in that role, no longer only a figure on the bench, but a person running a table of seedlings, was a quiet revolution for Cristian. It was proof that people could move, not because someone else pulled them forcibly, but because they found a place that fit them. He and Sarah spoke less often about what had been, and more about what needed doing. She started to sleep at a women's shelter during the week and returned to her tarp on weekends. She insisted he collect the tickets from the hardware stores lost and found, small, mundane things that people misplaced and forgot. She also insisted he take the lunch shift on Wednesdays when the soup kitchen up the street needed volunteers. "You don't only owe me for the ticket," she joked once. "You owe the world some presents." He went. He ladled soup into paper bowls and watched as names became faces inside the steam. He listened to stories that had nothing to do with his own, and in that listening he found the shape of humility. To occupy the world without insisting it be arranged for you. The world outside did not stop rearranging itself. Michelle's life had become smoother in outward measures. A new car, a promotion, a chair in a community charity. She had not been punished by the public. At least not enough to snag the headlines that mattered to him. She had reorganized herself into a woman who left graceful distances between herself and the past. Sometimes Cristian caught her face in the windows of cafes when he passed, her profile calm, and felt a flicker of something, loss, yes, but also a steadying indifference. Henry disappeared into a job that took him to Atlanta for weeks at a time. Social media made everything he did look like an advertisement for the kind of life Cristian no longer wanted. One cold afternoon, a letter arrived that forced him into a decision. It was a summons to mediation, not a public trial, but a negotiation over certain claims Michelle had pressed forward. Papers were thick and clinical. A dispute over the distribution of a small trust, a question about a bonus he had received years before, and a suggestion of impropriety that, while technically ambiguous, would require the careful sorting of bank statements and invoices and character witnesses. Gina called him the next day, her voice lubricated with a fresh angle. "You can make a play with this," she said. "You can write a statement, leak it, let it blow up. People like a comeback." Cristian looked at the ticket in his wallet, then at the letter. The old muscle for spectacle flexed. Go to mediation, make accusations, publicly vindicate yourself. The payoff would be small on paper, but enormous in the currency of public esteem. He could hold court on talk shows and get his name cleaned as if laundering a stain. The thought was intoxicating. For a long time he let himself taste it. Sarah saw the letter sleeping on his kitchen counter. He'd left the paper there after Victor copied a set for him. She sat across the table with her hands wrapped around a mug and looked at him long enough for the question to be simple. "Are you doing this for yourself or for the noise?" He looked at her and felt the noise like a physical thing, bright, loud, hungry. "I don't know," he admitted. "Then don't," she said. "Do it because it will make the world less sharp for you, or because it will put food on a table, not because it will make strangers clap for the performance of your pain." Her words had the odd effect of clarifying rather than closing things. He had thought the mediation would be a salvage, a restoration. She wanted him to make a different calculation. He wrote a statement, but not an incendiary one. He demanded only what was fair, not what would provide him with an audience. In mediation, he spoke quietly and plainly, letting the facts do the work of the rhetoric. He refused to make the process into a theater of accusation. The settlement was modest and practical, a small sum to clear some arrears, and the finalization of the divorce on terms he could survive. No public vindication, no grand scolding of Michelle. The newspapers did not write anything that day. There was no social catharsis. There was, however, a thin sheet of paper from the court that said he had a right to a modest part of a retirement fund and that certain claims had been dismissed. It was not enough to rebuild his old life. It was enough to avoid certain immediate catastrophes. After the mediation, he walked out into an afternoon that felt thin and honest. Victor met him at the door and nodded. "You did what was necessary," Victor said. It was not praise. It was recognition. Cristian owed a lot of the work of healing to the ordinary repetition of days and the people who held him in them. But there was one final test, the kind that demands you act, not because you must, but because someone else once acted for you. Gina returned with an offer unlike any before, a ticket to a position she had arranged through a contact, a move into a logistics job that would require him to sign off lightly on certain shipments and to not ask too many questions. The pay was enough that he could breathe differently for a while. The job would require him not to document everything precisely. In other words, it would require a tiny compromise that would, over time, accrete into a moral erosion. Gina phrased it as a bridge. It felt like a pit. This time, the pivot came not from a conversation alone, but from the detail of a pair of boots Sarah wore one morning. They were old and mended, leather rubbed raw in a place that told him someone had sewn them by hand. She had been working at a community garden and had found an old pair of gloves someone had lost. She offered them to him when she saw his new problem with his hands raw from lifting. "People will ask you to cross small lines," she said, as he pulled the gloves on, "because small lines are easier to sell. They tell you it's temporary, they will make you comfortable again, and then ask for a bigger cost." "Why do you keep saying that?" he asked, meaning to be biting but only managing softness. "Because I learned the hard way," she said. "Once you sign for someone else's moral laundry, you usually find the smell follows you." He went to Gina and said no. It felt like a hinge sound, the small click of a door finally closing in a house he had been forced to own. Gina's face made a sour line. "You could do much better," she said. "Not at the price you mean," he answered. The answer felt small and great all at once. The last turn in his transformation was not announced. It happened in a kitchen where the smell of tomatoes made the air kind. The community arts program where Sarah worked had a rundown kitchen used once a week for meals to volunteer staff. The lead coordinator, an efficient woman named Alma, needed someone to catalogue donations and track inventory. The position was not glamorous, but it required the careful attention to paperwork that Cristian had once prided himself on. He applied. On his first day, he took to the work with a mixture of shame and relief. He filed gently, as if the papers deserved dignity. He organized labels and taught a volunteer how to record a donor's name properly. When he made a mistake, he admitted it and fixed it. The kids from the art table drifted in and out. Sarah sometimes carried over a tray of soup. Word passed that Cristian was reliable. The work did not erase history. It placed him somewhere useful. There were nights when the old hunger for spectacle returned, when the pain of what had been done to him felt like a live current. Those nights he walked to the bench where he and Sarah had shared the ticket and sat with his hands folded. But instead of letting the darkness unspool, he pulled out a small notebook and started writing the things he had done that day, no matter how small. Swept floor, fixed shelf, recorded donor. The act of listing soothed him. He began to find that dignity accumulates like sediment, layer by layer, tiny things that render a bedrock. Months became a season. He started to dream not of headlines but of modest security. A lock on an apartment door, a kettle that did not rattle, a bookshelf with a few well-chosen volumes. He was not rebuilding the life he had lost, precisely, but he was making one he could live in without performance, and without the need to demand the world's applause. There was an evening when Michelle called. He answered, because he had learned that avoidance looked like cowardice, and that sometimes conversation was a neat instrument of closure. She spoke in the separated tones of someone reading a script written in the margins of a life. "I hope you're okay," she said. "I read something about a program you volunteer at. It looks constructive." He listened. He told her that he was managing. He did not demand apologies. The legal file had sorted that into quiet corridors. He did not ask for explanations. The conversation ended with an exchange that was so plain he almost laughed at the ordinariness of it. They had both moved into different rhythms. The call was not a reconciliation so much as a quiet rounding off of two lives that had once shared a table. There came a night when a young man sat down beside him on the bench and began to cry. He had an infant in an untied sling, and a look that read exhaustion like a badge. He had been fired and had nowhere to go. The city offered folded maps of assistance and a few phone numbers that answered with machines. The year's cold had started to lace the seams of the nights. Cristian listened. He thought of his own early nights, of the way humiliation had once felt like a weather system he could not prepare for. He thought of Sarah, and of the thermos of coffee she had given him when his fingers would not stop shaking. He took out the ticket, not because it meant anything monetarily now, but because it had accrued a moral life. He handed it to the young man as if it were a talisman of human notice. "This won't solve everything," he said, "but it means someone saw you." The young man looked at him like a person rediscovering sound. "Who are you?" he asked, choking. "Someone who has been a long time in learning how to keep his hands honest," Cristian said. He walked with the young man to the community center and signed him up for an intake at the shelter. He used his small store of credit at the local food pantry and the social capital he had earned through months of consistent presence. The act cost him little and meant much. He did not post it or announce it. He did it because for him now helping was the measurement of worth. When he came back to the bench, Sarah was waiting, the thermos balanced between her knees like always. "You did the right thing," she said, with that flat certainty that had once been the map in his pocket. "Not because it paid back the ticket, but because it follows the example you were shown." He did not protest. He had begun to understand that she had not given him solutions, but examples, the way someone lives when they have been discarded and have decided not to discard others. That example had the radical effect of reorienting him. It was not dramatic, it was incremental and exacting. It required him to do the small human thing repeatedly until it accrued into habit. A year after the ticket had fluttered into a trash box and then been returned, Cristian rented a small studio. The apartment was modest, no view, a radiator that clanged in winter, a sink that backed up if you washed too many dishes at once. He chose it for the neighborhood that allowed him to walk to the hardware store and to the community center without a long commute. He hung a photograph on the wall, not of Michelle or of his old life, but of a small bench by a rain-slicked street and a thermos between two people. He pinned it up as a reminder that some things needed to be seen to exist. He invited Sarah to a meal at the little table. She blinked like someone unsure of invitations that were not given under the tarp. He fixed pasta with a thin sauce and bought bread with the weekly wages that came like steady rain. They ate and talked about the garden and the people who had turned up at the soup kitchen that week and the little triumphs in the hardware store. A client who thanked him by name, the satisfaction of a drawer that finally stayed organized. They laughed about small things, not because the absurdity of it was comic, but because laughter had become a muscle that signaled a world not always collapsing. "Do you ever regret the ticket?" she asked, stirring her bowl. He looked at the crumpled paper now framed in a small drawer, a relic he kept from habit. "I regret that I thought it would fix everything," he said. "But I don't regret that it was returned. I don't regret meeting you." She shook her head as if to clear the air of sentimentality. "I regret that you had to be humiliated," she said, "but not the rest. There's a difference." He thought of mercy as a currency, a small and honest legal tender they had been using. It had been dispensed not by a court, but by a woman whose life had been stripped and who had chosen to keep her own moral life intact. There was no final scene of riches returned or vindictive humiliation. There was, instead, a life that had been steadied and a small ritual that became the final proof of change. Cristian took his small savings and paid off a portion of a debt he had carried as a weight for years. It was not symbolic, it was practical. He used his new stability to help Sarah with a deposit for a shelter program that offered transitional housing for women looking to get back into the workforce. She had been resistant at first. Pride is a stubborn thing, but she accepted the offer as if it were a bridge rather than a gift. To accept was to step into a different kind of agency. He did not treat it like charity. He treated it like partnership. They celebrated that week with a meal of cheap wine and bread on his small table. They spoke quietly about the future, about small and reasonable things, a certification course for Sarah in community work, a plan for Cristian to save for proper winter boots, a promise to volunteer at the neighborhood clothing drive. "We won't be famous," he said, laughter shaking a little in his throat. "We'll be useful." "And maybe a little less haggard," Sarah added. It was the kind of joke that measured gain by less theatrical standards. It was true. Time, as it tends to, softened the sharp edges rather than erasing them. He still woke sometimes with the old hurt like a cold steam in his chest, but the hurt was no longer the axis of his life. He had found practices that returned him to being a neighbor rather than a spectacle. He had reassembled a social map where people recognized him and used his name with a small affection that did not require explanation. The final decisive moral test came one autumn afternoon when he received a phone call from a producer at a local radio station. They had found his name in old court files and wanted him to be on a segment about comeback stories. He listened to the pitch, the lights, the chairs, the applause of a listening audience. It was the very performance he had turned from so many months before. He thought of the cost of such a thing, re-entering the public eye, re-dramatizing pain, risking the neat narratives that reduce complex people into fables. He also thought of the possible good. If he used the platform to speak about homelessness and how systems fail people, perhaps he could change one policy or raise awareness enough to open a door for someone else. He went to the station. He sat under the lights and watched the microphone like an instrument that could be used either to order a public feast of pity or to serve a steady plate of truth. When the host asked him why he had refused the spectacle of litigation and instead chosen a life of small service, he answered in the way he had learned, honest and pragmatic. I could have tried to make a show of it, he said, but what I wanted was to be able to look at myself in the mirror and know I had not traded my integrity for applause. I work in a hardware store and I help at a community center. It's not glamorous. It has rhythm and it pays a modest rent, and when I see a person on a bench who needs a hand, I give it, because someone once gave me one. The segment did not change the world. It did, however, produce a few calls from listeners who wanted to volunteer at the soup kitchen, and a man who brought a stack of blankets to the community center because he'd been moved to do something. The world, in its diffuse way, shifted a fraction. When he emerged from the studio, the sun had the thin gold of late afternoon. Sarah was waiting for him with a thermos and 2 cups. She slid an arm into his, and they walked toward the community garden. They did not speak of him as a hero. They spoke of the day's tasks. At the garden gate, a young couple stood arguing quietly. One had misplaced a transplant, and the other had a cart with a broken wheel. Cristian slipped in and offered a hand. He fixed the wheel with a nail he had the pocket for. He handed over a pair of gloves without thinking of virtue. The act was small and felt in a way that made him ache with a sweet pride, like the actualization of everything he had once been given. He had not been restored to the life that had been taken. The house remained a house someone else lived in. Michelle had a life that appeared unruffled, and Henry had trajectories that no longer crossed his. But he had been reshaped into someone who could be present without proving himself in public. He had let go of the hunger for revenge because he had discovered a different hunger, the hunger to be useful and steady. That substituted hunger had, ironically, made him full. The bookends of his life were modest, a ticket that fluttered into a trash pile and a thermos shared on a bench. In between had been humiliation, cold, choice, steady work, refusal of quick fixes, and an unlikely trust offered by a woman who had once been homeless and who had chosen to live by her own code. Sarah had not fixed him with a miracle. She had intervened with a single, human decision that reverberated: return a thing that was lost, refuse to take advantage, teach life's small mercies. Her influence had been practical, steady, and insistently present. Years from that first night, when someone asked him about the moment that changed everything, he would not describe a courtroom or a headline. He would describe returning to the bench after a shift at the hardware store and watching a woman hold out a scrap of paper like a tiny, ridiculous flag of possibility. He would describe her hands and the way they had learned to keep treasure in pockets, Not because she had to, but because she chose to. He would describe the thermos and a pair of gloves and a photograph he had pinned to a wall as a reminder. Sometimes, just before the city went to sleep, he took the bus to the part of town where he had been most publicly reduced and sat for a while. He looked at the windows of the house he had once tried to keep and did not feel the old wanting. He had either forgiven or outgrown the need for it. He had instead started to keep a ledger of small kindnesses in his head rather than in a courtroom. He measured life by people helped rather than by debts extracted. That economy felt richer. On a quiet evening, with rain beginning to gloss the pavement and the city lights holding their small fires against the dark, he walked with Sarah to the bench. They shared the thermos. A young man new to the neighborhood sat 2 seats down, shivering in a coat too thin for the night. Cristian rose and offered his own gloves. They were worn at the fingertips, but clean. "Keep them," he said. The young man looked at him like a man offered a small, perfect lie about the world. "Why would you?" "Because someone once gave me something I couldn't have bought," Cristian said, "and it changed how I measure things." Sarah laughed, a small sound that meant the work had been done. "He doesn't hand them out lightly," she said. "He keeps them honest." When the young man thanked him, it sounded like a prayer he had learned in the wrong language. The city hummed around them, cars, distant music, the smell of rain rising off hot pavement. Cristian held the thermos, felt its warmth, and realized that his life had been rebuilt not by the restoration of old things, but by the patient accumulation of small actions that made him capable of living in a way that fit his new moral measure. In the end, the ticket had not been the solution. The ticket had been a beginning, a small, accidental event that exposed him to the kind of generosity he had not expected from the world. The woman who had found it and returned it had not been a savior so much as a teacher. She taught by example that dignity is kept by the steady refusal to exploit and by the decision to be present, even when that presence seems to cost little and to gain less in worldly terms. Cristian's life settled into a rhythm that would have surprised the man who had once believed laughter would fix everything. He learned to laugh differently, not as a tool to coax favor, but as a human response to the relief of not having to perform. He learned to sleep without the nightmare of immediate loss. He learned to make small plans and keep them. He learned that some forms of healing are not loud. They are small, repetitive, and tending. When people asked what had saved him, he said Sarah's name. He said it with the quiet certainty of someone who knows debt is not always settled with money. He said it as a witness to a life that had been returned to the possibility of ordinary human service. He never forgot the ticket. He framed it once, then took it down, choosing to hold its meaning in his hands rather than on his wall. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and quiet transformation. Then tell us in the comments who changed your life unexpectedly.